This is Edgar Allan Poe. But you probably already know that, because Poe has one of the most recognisably dreary, melancholy, and downright haunted faces going. Why was Poe so darn sad-looking? Well, to put it simply, his entire life reads as a Gothic horror story. And I'm going to jump straight in here with multiple content warnings for discussions of death, depression, suicide, gambling, alcoholism, addiction, self-harm, and mental illness, because Poe's was not a cheery life. His father abandoned him. His mother died of tuberculosis while he was in infancy. He married his first cousin, Virginia Clem, when she was just 13 years old, and eventually lost her to tuberculosis too, which devastated him, and after which he was found apparently on numerous occasions at the dead hour of a winter night, sitting beside her tomb, almost frozen in the snow, where he had wandered from his bed, weeping and wailing. He lost others in sorrowful circumstances too, including his brother, his surrogate mother, and his foster mother, and he experienced painful bouts of romantic heartbreak. He was also known to be very argumentative, pretentious, a chronic alcoholic, a gambling addict. Despite his talents, he never really managed to claw his way out of poverty, and he was suicidally depressed. This photo was taken in November 1848, just 4 days after Poe attempted suicide, and less than a year before his death. So, evidently, he was not in a good place. Poe, we might then say, has a whole host of reasons to look so distressed, but circumstances weren't always so dreadful for our dear Edgar. In fact, in 1845, he experienced a significant bout of success after the publication of a single poem that elevated him to the status of celebrity, and which has been enduringly popular and voraciously studied ever since. That poem is, of course, The Raven. John M. Daniel, editor of the Semi-Weekly Examiner and witness to Poe's very last public recitation of The Raven, described it as a poem stamped with the image of true genius, and genius in its happiest hour. It is one of those things an author never does but once. But this leaves me with a few burning questions. Why was this poem, in particular, so incredibly popular upon its reception? How did it come to shape Poe's reputation for poetic genius? And indeed, why has The Raven gone down in history as one of the most frightful poems ever written? The answer lies in Poe's unique Gothic mode, his intimate knowledge of his readership, and his talent for manipulating our deepest fears. But before we get into all that, hello, I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe, this is Mousy the Monstrous, and we make videos on literature, the good, the great, and the Gothic, so please subscribe if that's your jam. As always, an incalculably large thank you to our patrons over on Patreon. We are so grateful for your support. It enables us to buy cool props and costumes, like these talons from Birdzilla Creations on Etsy, who were super lovely. I'll put a link down below if you would like to get your own pair of talons, and I'll also put a link to our Patreon page if you fancy joining up. Now, this is a spooky video about a spooky guy, so please bear that in mind as you join me down the rabbit hole of Poe's troubling, haunting, maddening imagination to answer the ultimate question. What is it about The Raven that gets so embedded in the darkest recesses of your psyche? Perhaps unusually, I'm going to start answering that question not by diving straight into a close study of The Raven and the mystery concealed within its pages, but by journeying back in time to the 3rd of October 1849 to examine an altogether different mystery, one that has come to fascinate our morbid curiosity for almost 170 years. The tragic and untimely death of Edgar Allan Poe. It is a truth universally acknowledged, maybe, that if a writer dies a tragic and untimely death, readers will struggle to separate that tragedy from their writing. The same goes for any artist, really. A tragic death can so easily colour our perception of the work, and we might start to read things into a novel, a poem, a painting, or a song that we wouldn't have had the artist died peacefully, aged 90, in bed, surrounded by their friends and family. Now, this is, of course, not always the case, but it's important to be aware of how an artist's death can retroactively inform our perception of their life and work. And it's certainly something to bear in mind when we read Poe, who not only died tragically in poverty and when he was only 40 years old, but he died under mysterious circumstances, the mystery of which, to this very day, has yet to be unravelled. On the 3rd of October, 1849, Joseph Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, was walking the streets of Baltimore when he found a semi-conscious, seemingly delirious and severely distressed-looking man lying in the gutter. Upon closer inspection, he realised that this man was, indeed, Edgar Allan Poe. Walker tried to help Poe, but as Natasha Geiling writes, Poe never regained enough consciousness to explain how he had come to be found, in soiled clothes not his own, incoherent on the streets. Instead, Poe spent his final days wavering between fits of delirium, gripped by visual hallucinations. The night before his death, according to his attending physician, John J. Moran, Poe repeatedly called out for Reynolds, a figure who, to this day, remains a mystery. Who is this Reynolds? We don't know. But perhaps more pressingly, we also don't know how Poe ended up deliriously stumbling about the streets of Baltimore or what he actually died from. Check his death certificate, I hear you cry, but alas, no such written evidence exists. That we know of, at least. The only contemporary public reference to a specific cause of death was from the Baltimore Clipper, a somewhat cryptic congestion of the brain. But this asks more questions than it answers, which has led people to speculate. Was his death alcohol-related? Was he the victim of carbon monoxide poisoning? Did he have rabies? A brain tumour? Had he been beaten within an inch of his life? Or had he fallen foul of a practice known as cooping, a method of voter fraud practiced by gangs in the 19th century where an unsuspecting victim would be kidnapped, disguised, and forced to vote for a specific candidate multiple times under multiple disguised identities? We just don't know. Unless his death certificate pops up in a box in someone's attic or in the dusty records of an old archive, the cause of and circumstances surrounding Poe's demise are likely to remain a mystery. The question then becomes, for me at least, how much does this mystery inform our reading of Poe's work? It's so easy to read Poe's tragic life and death as an extension of the tragedy and mystery we read in his fiction. This blurring of the boundary between life and art, between the suffering, say, of the writer and the suffering of the characters in the writing, brings us to The Raven, a poem that is, amongst other things, a depiction of a man suffering a mental breakdown that culminates in an untimely demise. Enter Edgar. And not only is there a blurring of boundaries between Poe and the poem's suffering speaker, it's also arguable that there's an unsettling synthesis between Poe and the Raven, the bird itself, the speaker's tormentor, the harbinger of destruction, not least because during Poe's lifetime people would literally refer to him as the Raven in honour of the poem. What I'm getting at here is that we, as readers, have always read mystery, darkness and suffering in Poe. In his writing, sure, but in his life and death too, and our insatiable appetite for the unending mystery of Poe and the uncomfortable breakdown of the boundary between the man and the horrors of his imagination is one reason a poem like The Raven has survived and transformed in our shared cultural consciousness for almost 170 long, dark years. The Raven was, and is, insatiably popular. Even if you've never read it, you know it. There have been countless Raven parodies, films, plays, musical adaptations, rap battles, cartoons. It has been endlessly translated, illustrated, and co-opted in ways you might not expect. The Baltimore Ravens football team was named after Poe's poem by popular vote, for example. You name it, there's a Raven version of it. And it's worth noting that the poem was insatiably popular upon its publication. This wasn't a case of author doesn't get recognition until after his death. The Raven was an immediate success for Poe. He was repeatedly asked to recite The Raven, which he did on a variety of occasions, including at a high school graduation ceremony. The Raven was internationally celebrated. His friend and fellow writer Elizabeth Barrett wrote to him that, "Your Raven has produced a sensation, a fit of horror here in England. Some of my friends are taken by the fear of it, and some by the music. I hear of persons haunted by Nevermore, and one acquaintance of mine who has the misfortune of possessing a bust of Pallas can never bear to look at it in the twilight." Countless readers indulged and continue to indulge their worst fears in Poe's verse, and as a result, The Raven has become shared cultural property, obsessed over, learned by heart, loved and read over and over by a multitude of fans, from Abraham Lincoln to Lisa Simpson. But why all the drama? I mean, Poe's hardly the originator of the Gothic. He's writing decades after Mother Radcliffe, who you can learn more about in our series on 1790s Gothic, link in the description. What was it about this single, solitary poem that caused such rapture? The uncanny synthesis between Poe and his poem is one factor that I've already touched on, but there are several other factors that go towards answering this question. So let's start our deep dive, where perhaps we ought, with Poe's technical, poetical skill. In essence, Poe was a very good poet who made very good use of a variety of poetic techniques to craft a beguiling, complex yet readable and engaging poem. His rhyme scheme, use of internal rhyme, and compelling use of alliteration that contributes to the lulling, incantatory quality of the language all come together to tell us one important thing. Poe was a consummate craftsman. You don't have to look much further than his use of metre to get a sense of this. As Celeste Neal writes, the poem's sonorous and inexorable metre is one of the main reasons for its fame, as it gives the feel of a pagan chant, whilst the internal rhyme and alliteration help make it more memorable and drive the story forward. The Raven is mostly, and famously, written in trochaic octameter. What does that mean? Well, each line is made up of 8 trochaic metrical feet. You've got 16 syllables per line, and each foot has a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. So the poem opens. And so we see that trochaic octameter in effect, an effect Poe seems to capitalise on to create a sense of unease. Starting with the stressed syllable sounds jarring. It's considered antithetical to the natural, easeful rhythm often associated with human speech. It's the opposite of an iambic metre, the kind we get in Shakespeare's sonnets. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. This line, rather than stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, goes unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. The metre produces a pleasing flow of words, appropriate for a love poem. But The Raven is not a love poem, at least not in the traditional sense. It's a poem about the misery of loss, about what happens after love goes away, and so the stilted unease of the trochaic metre works to unsettle us as we come to learn more about the speaker's suffering. Poe's use of metre is disquieting, memorable, and easy to read. And this brings us to the next reason for The Raven's impressive and immediate success. Poe wrote it with the wants and needs of his readership very much in mind. In his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, which we'll be returning to a few times in this video because it's pretty much entirely about how and why he wrote The Raven, Poe says that he set out to write a poem to suit at once the popular and the critical taste. He knows his readership. He knows what the reviewers will be looking for, and what his general readers want from a poem, and he delivers on both fronts, writing a poem that suits the Gothic sensibilities of the time, is easy to read in terms of metre and rhythm, and is therefore memorable, but which is not without its impressive, skillful literary complexity. Poe's careful calculation and thorough construction of the poem makes it difficult to forget. It's musical, resonant, haunting. This is a poem carefully balanced to cater to all. A quick side note, just because Poe knew his audience doesn't mean he liked them. In fact, as Jill Lepore argues, Poe strenuously resented his public. You love Poe or you don't, but either way, Poe doesn't love you. A writer more condescending to more adoring readers would be hard to find. So yeah, The Raven isn't Poe's labour of love dedicated to his loyal public. It's carefully composed to line his pockets, which, despite its success, it failed to do. So, Poe was a talented poet, and he knew how to write for a varied audience. But the poem's success rested on a lot more than its technical composition and Poe's playing to the market. To really understand why The Raven was, and is, so popular, we have to dig a little deeper. Although Poe contends that the process of composition of the poem was ultra-rational, the motive for the poem seems to have been unreasoning sorrow. This is love bitterly lost. It is, as Poe touches on in his essay, mournful and never-ending remembrance. Something I think most of us can relate to in one way or another. Poe taps in to our universal experience of loss and the potential for an endless helplessness that comes with it, and he captures this sense of harrowing misery nowhere more succinctly and devastatingly than in the Raven's single-word response to anything and everything the speaker says, nevermore. The meaning and the implication behind the Raven's one-word answer shifts between stanzas. But the Raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. So here, the nevermore implies that, contrary to what the speaker assumes, the bird will never leave him. Whatever the bird represents, death, madness, sorrow, mystery, misery, it will not go from his door. But then, in this stanza, the meaning of nevermore changes. "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if, within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." The meaning of nevermore shifts, but it always remains in some way an unremittingly grim mantra. So in this stanza, the speaker is getting desperate, imploring the bird to tell him, to reassure him that in heaven his soul will be reunited with his lost love Lenore, to which the raven replies, "Nevermore." There's no peace at the end of this. There's no angelic woman waiting for him. Death will not relieve his grief. Here we have what may well be the key to the poem. The black bird represents the student's infinite memory of his lost Lenore, Poe's ceaseless memory of those he loved and lost, and indeed our own unending memory of our own lost loved ones. However, this unending sense of loss is not the only universal, relatable theme that makes The Raven so popular. As much as it is about the loss of a loved one, this is a poem about the loss of the mind, about self-damnation, about the horror that comes from within. As Poe puts it in his essay on the poem, the student, that's the speaker, essentially succumbs to the bird because he is impelled by the human thirst for self-torture. He cannot but indulge in the luxury of sorrow. The poem speaker knows that asking questions of the bird will worsen his situation, knows that he won't get the answers he's looking for, but he's addicted to harming himself, to the luxury of sorrow. And this feels familiar to me, this idea of finding comfort in bad situations or habits, of depression, say, functioning as a sanctuary of sorts because it feels familiar or safe. I'm sure we can all relate to a greater or a lesser extent to how it feels to do something we know is bad for us, but we do it anyway. It feels like maybe we can't help it. Poe brings out the universal agony and contradiction of addiction in the relationship between the speaker and the raven, presenting us, and this is important, with a Gothic mode that is very much rooted in the psychological. As Tom Wright puts it, Poe makes the Gothic all about the interior life and psyche of the narrator. Whereas other Gothic writers looked externally to create fear, your haunted castles, your haunted suits of armour, your haunted paintings with eyes that move and what have you, Poe is concerned with fear that comes from within. Our speaker isn't a heroic figure pursued by an evil villain who manages against all odds to remain true to himself and inherently good. He is a man lost, floundering, hounded by his own demons represented in the form of the bird. Now, I want to point out here that Poe wasn't the first writer to do this. Gothic trailblazer Joanna Baillie, writing decades before Poe, penned a fantastic play called Horror that takes us into the protagonist's most unsettled mental recesses and which you can learn about here, link in the description. Nevertheless, Poe's psychological horror deftly captured and continues to capture the imagination of his reading public. Essentially, he divined how he could manipulate the conventions of Gothicism to create fine psychological fiction, creating, as he himself put it, a terror of the soul. And really, what's more harrowing than the monsters that dwell in the depths of our own minds? That's what our speaker is grappling with in The Raven, and is ultimately what he succumbs to. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. The speaker's soul, his very essence, is gone from him, never to be revived from this horrifying state. He suffers a breakdown, essentially, and is left utterly harrowed by the torments of his own mind, represented by the bird perched atop his chamber door. But where does this leave us, as readers? Is the potential relatability of the speaker's loss, mental illness, and tragic demise enough to explain why we keep coming back to this poem over and over? There's one more factor I want to draw on here that I think really cements how and why we read and reread The Raven. Poe's writing, it is often said, is full of unreliable narrators, characters who we, as readers, cannot trust. And this is yet another reason for the poem's mass appeal. Not only does it speak to the dark parts of our collective psyche, tickles our propensity for madness, and aggravates our fears and sorrows surrounding grief and loss, but it titillates us. Who could resist an unreliable narrator, keeping us forever on our toes, forever unnerved and uncertain, entranced by the fact that we cannot know for sure whether or not what we're being told is true? Poe presents us with a legion of horrors in this poem. We're made to face the torment of losing loved ones, of losing control over our senses and our actions, and of losing our minds. And we, as readers, unsure of the speaker's veracity, are left to flounder in this state of perpetual loss, forever in the grasp of the unknown. This, I think, taps into our deepest fears, those involving who we are, our sense of identity, and how easily our state of mind can teeter over into that dark place that resides within. Not only is the poem technically brilliant, but it contains a range of universal, relatable themes that cannot help but send us into a frenzied panic, pulse quickening, heart palpitating. We must face, in The Raven, what it means to have all our hopes, our loves, our identity, and our sanity threatened and then cast on the blaze. What's that? Do I hear a whimper? Surely this isn't the end, I hear you plead. Surely I can pick myself up and feel happy again. Nah, says the Raven. Says Poe. Never more. Cheery stuff, right? I would love to know what you think of the phenomenon that is Poe's The Raven. Do you find it scary? Do you prefer one of his many other works? Is there a crucial piece of analysis you think I've missed? Do let me know in the comments below. Love a Gothic writer who takes you on a journey into the darkest recesses of the psyche? Watch our video on the psychological horror of the Gothic heroine by clicking here next.